I know in the past I've shared how I have a bit of a food obsession. It might be that I'm half Sicilian, actually. But when I think about sheep, I must confess, my first thoughts go to summertime and grilled lamb chops with garlic and rosemary. Are you there with me? Lamb chops, yes. In Australia, I think you know that I spent about 8 months in Australia in 2008 in Jesuit finishing school, and one of my assignments was to go work in rural towns in South Australia where they have the sheep stations. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of sheep. At one point I was working in a parish and one of the ranchers said, "Father David, why don't you come back, and we'll actually give you a shot at shearing the sheep." I thought, okay, give that a shot. I get to this ranch station, and first thing I notice is the smell. If you've been around livestock, it's a special experience. And then in the shed were all these poor creatures, some of them half naked, and the rest of them waiting. They looked terrified. And as they were corralled toward the shearing area, the rather amazing ranchers would just flip these guys up, sit them down, and shear them off. In about 2 minutes, they'd be looking as skinny as you can imagine. Kind of pathetic, actually. And I gave it a shot. These things are as greasy and smelly as you can imagine. So it wasn't like the most, romantic experience. Nothing like, what was that movie? The Thorn Birds, right? In the ancient Mediterranean, though, it really wasn't about the lamb chops. And it wasn't really only about the wool. In the ancient Mediterranean, the scale of shepherding was much smaller, and sheep were basically kept for their milk and to produce the clothing. So when we think about shepherds and sheep, it's a little bit of a distant reality, I know, for most of us, but these small flocks were not only precious to the livelihood and the welfare of communities back at that time, but the shepherd taking care of these small flocks treated them much like we would treat our own pets, with a great deal of concern and affection. And I'm sure on the way out the door, young shepherds were told by their dads and moms, the sheep first when the wolf comes. It's pretty powerful, actually. Put the sheep before yourselves when the wolf comes. Our community's welfare relies on the sort of health of this flock. In the ancient times, David was considered the shepherd king. Didn't have a perfect record, as we know, but nonetheless, he established for the Jewish people this notion that kingship was about being a good shepherd. It was about maintaining the good of the whole flock first. And certainly, Jesus, of course, is in that tradition. And he identifies himself in these passages in John's Gospel as the Good Shepherd. It's a way of emphasizing the kind of relationship he has to his followers, that he is not about himself first, that he is for them first and for us. Self-sacrificing, even as he says here and as we know, to the point of his own death. Now, in our own times, I would say this image of the Good Shepherd is a little hard for us to relate to, but we might think of what we call the servant leader. How many of you have heard that expression? Raise your hands, the servant leader. Is that familiar to you or no? Only a few. This notion of the servant leader became popular in sort of management literature in the 70s when a particular executive from AT&T retired, Robert Greenleaf, and he began to reflect on the power of Jesus' example for the ways that people should lead in corporations, in civil society, in the church, with a sense of altruism and ethics, transparency, and a clear priority for the good of the other before the good of oneself. To see themselves in the service of their organizations, to value the well-being and the flourishing of their people by investing in their development. That success is always about more than the bottom line or about winning. It's about the good of your people. And while identified and inspired by Jesus, servant leadership is certainly not exclusive to Christianity. In fact, thousands of years ago, a Chinese wise man by the name of Lao Tzu wrote about the excellent leader, who is one that is so gentle, loving, and beneficent that when the people have finished a great achievement, they look at it and say, "We did this together," rather than pointing to the leader himself. Now, in the news, I'll grant you, we don't hear much about servant leaders. They're out there. I'm privileged to know a few, but largely we focus on the third world dictators, the corrupt politicians, the greedy CEOs, and, if we're honest, even our own sometimes self-serving church officials. Of course, we expect more. Of course, we should expect altruism and excellence and a commitment to the good of others before themselves. And at the same time, can we be so surprised that leaders are human, like us? And the way of the world is powerful. And when people are put into positions of authority, that power can often go to their heads. Of course, Jesus sets a high bar, a very high bar, that a person be willing to put aside not only their own interests, but ultimately, on one extreme end of the scale, their own life for the good of others. This example sometimes might feel so extreme and distant, it's hard for us to relate to. But we know there are so many other ways that we put ourselves aside to allow others to be first. And this is what servant leadership is, not only for CEOs and leaders of banks or corporations or politicians, but servant leadership is for us, in our families, in our communities, in the teams that we play on. It's about expressing love by transcending our own egos and learning that the real joy and satisfaction of life is in serving others. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a few times when I suggest we put ourselves first. And maybe some of you will remind me of what I said about getting the biggest piece of apple pie when I was a kid once upon a time. I've grown up. I've learned that other people need to get the dessert first. But there are other times when we need to put ourselves first, like on the airplane, putting that oxygen mask on before we try to help others, right? It's also not a bad thing to go first when we're trying to take the log out of our own eye before trying to take the splinter out of someone else's. As Gandhi would say, to be the change that we desire to see in the world. And you know, I'm sure there are actually a few generous people in this crowd who actually need to hear the opposite message, that it's important to take a look at yourselves and your own needs a little bit more often than you do. But generally, I think we need to emphasize, in order to be a decent human being these days, let alone a true disciple of Christ and servant leader, we too need to work at gradually transcending our own natural tendencies to serve ourselves, and instead to discover, as Albert Schweitzer said once, that the greatest happiness is learning to serve others first.